Shabbat Shalom. We have a double portion this morning, Acharei Mot-Kedoshim. And in years such as this one, when the Parashat are doubled, I like to think of the two Parashat speaking to each other like chavruta, a pair of study partners, respectfully in dialogue, each favoring a different model for how to engage in relationship. Acharei Mot provides a roadmap for maintaining cohesive communal bonds and intimacy with the divine through rituals of reunification, atonement, right? Or as some people like to call it, at-one-ment. Kedoshim, on the other hand, sets out a paradigm for holiness in relationship achieved primarily through setting limits, separation, boundaries. Closeness is not without its dangers, says the first. As we learn from the terrible tragedy of Nadav and Avihu, even the priests must take great care in approaching the holiest place, but ultimately with proper precautions, holy PPE, so to speak. Closeness is fundamentally what's needed to create a holy community. What separates sin from the community is bringing offerings, korbanot, right? And the word korban comes from the root, kuf resh vet, which means to bring close. So bringing a korban, an offering, served to keep God close to the people and the people close to God. Then I picture Kedoshim sort of rubbing her chin a bit, pondering this, and presenting some opposing arguments. Cases where too much closeness is dangerous, potentially leading to sexual impropriety or impartial court systems. Moreover, boundaries and limits not only protect, they provide, right? By leaving the four corners of our field, by limiting our consumption, we make sure there's enough for everyone else. The children of Israel themselves are in this portion are called separate, right? Vehivdalti, God says, I separated you from other nations, and that they alone worship Adonai. So for Kedoshim, sacred community is achieved through thoughtful limit setting and boundaries. And in my imaginary Beit Midrash, these two Parshiot sit arguing, each for their very distinct view. But of course, the lines aren't quite so neatly drawn, and there's indeed overlap in these two Parshiot. At stake, though, is the very definition of holiness itself. Is the sacred an experience of the divine found in proper adherence to ritual, or is it achieved through proper adherence to a moral code? If we take the Torah at her word, at least the words that appear most often, she's primarily concerned with the way we treat our fellow human beings, the stranger, and those on the margins, through faithful commitment to the covenant, which binds us to each other and to God. In a word, what does the Torah care about most? Relationships. Kedoshim certainly highlights this understanding of holiness, giving us some of the most often quoted verses of the Torah. You shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Do not deal basely with your neighbor. Do not profit by, or some say stand by, the blood of your neighbor. You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Love your fellow or your neighbor as yourself. For verses that are situated in Leviticus, these are surprisingly oriented toward the moral rather than the ritual, right? The priests tend to be really interested in ritual. So the biblical scholar Israel Knoll believes that this holiness code is a later addition to the priestly source. And that perhaps explains its distinctiveness from other sections of Leviticus, which are more focused on the ritual sacrifices. And also the rabbis we see seek to harmonize these understandings of holiness, looking to the prophets' view of the relationship between ritual the ritual and the moral in creating the sacred community. So for the rabbis, to regard the ritual of Yom Kippur as being primarily about maintaining a close relationship with God is to completely misunderstand it. Right? As the famous Mishnah states, transgressions between a person and God, Yom Kippur affects atonement only after one has appeased one's fellow. We know this, it's in the Machzor. Shai Held brings an interesting argument. He says that the Haftarah that we read on Yom Kippur is coming with a more stringent admonition. Does Isaiah imagine God saying, in effect, I'm glad you're here to repent for violating Shabbat and eating treif, but as for your interpersonal crimes, go apologize to your victims first and then come back? Hardly, continues Held. Isaiah imagines God saying, I cannot fathom what you think you're doing here. Until you've dealt with the wrong you have done to others, you have no business here at all. The ritual of Yom Kippur in the prophetic and rabbinic imagination is not a separate path to holiness, but one that must take place only in the context of moral integrity. The closeness the priests sought to achieve ritually was impossible without certain limits around behavior. Mircea Eliade, one of the most important religious thinkers of the 20th century, writes about what it means to call something sacred. In his book, The Sacred and the Profane, he claims, by manifesting the sacred, any object becomes something else, yet it continues to remain itself. A sacred stone remains a stone. Nothing distinguishes it from all other stones. But for those to whom a stone reveals itself as sacred, its immediate reality is transmuted into a supernatural reality. For Eliade, anything can be made holy as long as it is imbued with sanctity. However, anything can also be made profane for our actions, if our actions serve to deny its sanctity. While here Eliade is examining the question of sacred objects, perhaps the same could be applied to relationships as well. The Torah understands that relationships are imbued with holiness, both through closeness and through appropriate boundaries. They require tremendous work, a careful balancing act in which self-awareness, trust, communication, and respect must be cultivated through both our words and our deeds. Ritual comes not as a substitute for creating sacred relationships with one another, but as a reminder to do so. The special closeness, the experience of the sacred achieved through ritual is only a touchstone, such that in a short moment, we might be reminded of the depth of our commitments to one another, and ultimately the love we are to have for our fellows and ourselves. These two approaches to holiness perhaps come together best at the end of Shabbat, Havdalah. Havdalah means separation. The spices at Havdalah remind us of the korbanot, right? We often say that the spices are meant to help us ease into the week, to smell something sweet, to give us a sense of, so we're not so sad, we get to smell something sweet before the end of Shabbat, but perhaps it also invokes the korbanot, right? The incense offering, that closeness with God that we experience during Shabbat. Well, the blessing that we recite at the end of Havdalah, acknowledging the separation between holy and profane, is precisely what allows sacred time to exist in the first place, that separation. If it didn't exist, we wouldn't have holiness, we wouldn't have something special. It's at that moment, at the end of Shabbat, this ritual that we do, when we bring together taste, smell, and sight, the sensory power of ritual at its best, to bring our awareness back to the imperfection of the world, a world which desperately, desperately needs our tending. The end of Shabbat, we recommit ourselves to doing that work. We must separate ourselves from the sacred in order to do that work, in order to ultimately bring more holiness into the world. I hope many of you will join me tonight on our Facebook page for Havdalah, whether you got a Havdalah kit from the shul or maybe you'll use your own beautiful set you have at home. It's a way we can be together. And even as we remain physically separated from one another, we're trying to find new ways of experiencing spiritual connection through ritual. I just hope that these shared rituals continue to remind us of our ultimate goal, to create sacred relationships with those near and far, built upon respect, kindness, and love. Shabbat Shalom.